The memory of the days of blood still haunted Europe, in the eyes of its elders and in the minds of their children. The Days of Blood was the deadliest conflict in all of recorded history, resulting in the deaths of 12 million soldiers, and even more tragically, it had been since estimated that between 150 and 200 million non-combatants, 20% of Europe's entire population, perished over the course of that conflict. Innocent men, women, and children killed in their uncountable multitudes by famine, disease, riots, fires, and roving gangs both of the Catholic and Protestant sort. But now, in 1836, the Pax Melitensis, the Peace of Malta, officially entered its 86th year, and had so presided over 86 years of absolute peace in Europe. Things were far better than they had been for an age, and the people of Europe were on the whole overjoyed to be living in the midst of the most enduring peace the continent had in living memory. However, this didn't mean this peace was perfect. Especially after some men had lived and died their whole lives without seeing conflict, certain problems went unresolved, both in the Federal Republic of Vannin and abroad. Chief among these issues were the religious gangs, who only calmed down somewhat since the Pax Melitensis began. Catholics in Halby to the north regularly rode south to terrorize Protestants in the south, and Protestants in Sachsen were known to sail to Nairn and spill the blood of Catholics as they pleased. This was true in the New World and the rest of Europe as well, and it wasn't going to go away anytime soon. While it wasn't on the sheer scale that it was during the Days of Blood, it wasn't uncommon for a dozen people to be hanged in the religiously mixed countryside every month or two, or a shop to burn down in the poorer parts of the cities. This was true, be it in France, Scandinavia, or the Burgos Federation. Indeed, it was especially frightful in Scandinavia, which hosted a Jewish minority in the millions. No other nation on the continent had been very friendly to them, but Emperor Halfdan Laxson of Denmark welcomed them in 1372, almost 500 years ago. In 1836, they numbered at between 3 and 5 million out of 7 million in all of Europe, making up just less than a third of the entire population of Scandinavia. Religious strife was always common there, but since the Days of Blood, Protestant and Catholic gangs targeted the Jews more than they did each other, staging pogroms against poor Jews in Finland especially. This was made worse due to the fact that many of these Jews were monarchists, loyal to the crown which granted them tolerance, and viewed by many layfolk as enemies of the Republic. Still, they adapted, and by 1835, since many Jews were themselves landowners, were thus able to vote and hold office in Scandinavia, making up a significant portion of the functioning electorate and preserving the tolerance of their people. Even the franchise was divided along religious lines, with the landless Protestant poor and middle classes desiring the vote, but the outnumbered Jews wishing to restrict voting to those who did not so fervently wish for their death. The Catholics were a wild card on that contentious issue of the day, either supporting restricted voting due to their fear of being outvoted by Protestants, or advocating for the free franchise of all men to unseat the political power of the Jews. Such was Scandinavia in those days, but without an absolute monarch to protect that state of affairs, it remained to be seen if it was a consensus-building republic or a house of cards waiting to collapse. In short, religious divides were the most deeply ingrained division there was at the time. Another issue was how the beginnings of industrialism had started to leave people behind. Though of course at this point industry only consisted of early trains, textile mills, and steamboats, the poor had begun to move into the cities, and savvy businessmen began to exploit them. Incidentally, this was also linked with the next big issue, which was the lethargic state of democracy as a whole. While Vannin had thrown off the shackles of monarchy and oligarchy in 1751, and indeed all landowning men were allowed to vote, what they were allowed to vote for had decayed in quality over the years. The 4-year terms of presidents were given no limit on re-election, which allowed the exceptionally powerful executive office to accrue an immense amount of wealth as a result. Indeed, in 1825, the term of office was extended to a massive 10 years. This was also true of the legislative body known as the Quail. As these men made the laws, the temptation to make themselves wealthy was too much to bear. Their corruption was subtle, though not unnoticed by the common man. For example, In 1828, the Quail passed a law subsidizing cotton production. Then the president, as the head of the Grand Atlantic Charter, gave the contract to himself and did business with the plantations owned by his counterparts in the Quail, making everybody involved that much richer. There was no judicial body to counter this or any official written constitution other than the Daneley Statement of Purpose, but there had been a movement to enact these things for quite some time. The other democracies of the world, like Scandinavia and the Qing, looked to Vannonia for guidance, and so fell largely into the same pitfalls. And though Scandinavia did found a supervisory court system, it was largely used to victimize their colonists who were not allowed to vote. The Grand Republic of the Qing was so unstable, in fact, that their office of president became an office served for life. One of their presidents, a man of Tibetan descent named Sewang Dulkar, who was the first lifelong president, even managed to change the name of the Grand Republic to the Grand Republic of China. So, such was the state of things by 1836. A world largely without war, but still bearing the terrible scars of it. Meanwhile, under Vannonia's president, Connor Ayton, a general tax increase was passed in late January, largely due to the general overhaul of colonial policy and infrastructure that came with the extension of voting rights to colonial merchants which did not directly own land, but were otherwise educated gentlemen, of which there were many. Speaking of the New World, the Vannonian drive to expand there had become more unfocused. In fact, they were often personal ventures, which would then become incorporated into the larger republic. For example, much of Central America had been colonized by Vannonia, headed up mostly by independently wealthy slave owners who sought more land for development. This proved providential, as in March the gold rush began in Culacan, leading to a great flock of European immigrants moving to the region. Scandinavia also managed to settle California in the hopes of striking gold there themselves. In August, Poland had reached the very brink of revolution, the millions of Lithuanians under their purview unsatisfied that they had no say in government. As such, to defuse the situation and save Poland, the Lithuanians were reluctantly invited to join them in administering certain parts of the government, officially founding Poland-Lithuania to assuage everyone involved, especially the more radical independence elements among them. Meanwhile, in Vannonia, the 1837 elections were almost complete. Vannonia had 3 major political parties, though only one had seen major success in the last 50 years. This was the National Party, a group of established, land-owning reactionaries that supported protectionism, state capitalism, religious moralism, immigrant exclusion from citizenship, and jingoism. They were soft on the memory of the monad family, still thought of war as a glorious endeavor, and were the ones at the forefront of the campaign to empower the executive office. The Conservative Party held a plurality in seats in the Quail, which differed that they were less interventionist in the economy and were simply pro-military instead of jingoistic. The Liberal Party was the most radical faction at the time and also held the fewest seats, advocating for free trade, laissez-faire economic policy, religious pluralism, limited immigrant citizenship, and fiercely anti-military views, seeking to kneecap the power of the armed forces and withdraw from international affairs. Against this backdrop, the 1837 election saw the national candidate, presidential Thorgil Scott, secure 75% of the vote, as well as the National Party take yet more seats in the Quail. President Scott's policies would see an ambitious industrialization program effective immediately, stripping rights from certain mining guilds and investing in rail projects pursued by both government-owned businesses and private entrepreneurs. Poland-Lithuania demanded provinces from Alençon, but Italy came to mediate and prevent a war, thus preserving the Pax Melitensis. In 1839, Perm, a tiny Eastern European tsardom, declared itself the Russian Empire, and although it was a small state, it held great potential as the home of ethnic Russians everywhere. Later in January, Vannonia accepted an alliance offer from Benevento, who was not a signatory to the Treaty of Malta. In September, rebelling Basques seceded from the Burgos Federation and joined France. Upon demanding their return, the image of the Burgos Federation was devastated when France brought their ally Scandinavia into negotiations on their side, saying that they would not, in fact, return them. Riots soon broke out across the Vannonian North European exclave chain, as many people who lived there were ethnically Polish or Scandinavian. But these riots were eventually put down, much emphasis on eventually, as they would persist for many, many years. Meanwhile, the National Party continued to wield the quail in almost uncontested control, but such a long time in this condition had begun to make some of these politicians complacent. In February, Vannonia accepted an alliance offer from Neapolis in line with its policy of alliance building in order to contest the power of Poland, Lithuania, and Europe. In April, the issue of child labor reached the parliament floor, sparking fierce debates. The National Party, so secure in their belief that they would always be in power, declared that child labor was definitively illegal, and any family found sending those children to work, or any business found to employ anyone under the age of 16, would face imprisonment and be barred from owning businesses in the future. There was an exception, however, and this exception was what truly angered the people of Vannonia. The exception to the child labor laws put forward by the National Party was that child labor was only permissible at government-owned businesses, or businesses owned directly by government officials. The argument of the National Party was that only the government could be trusted not to abuse child workers. Sensing an opportunity to sweep up the votes of poor people who were desperate for money and the well-off who wanted cheap labor, as well as the wealthy who stood to be undercut by this move, the Conservative Party made the right to child labor and slavery a major part of their platform, which they called the right of familial labor and a man's right to his own property. The Conservative Party became so popular that the reactionaries soon entered into a coalition government with them, the first of its kind, which the Conservatives used to protect child labor and reduce total government interference in the economy. In 1841, snap elections were held to verify the legitimacy of the coalition government, President Scott seeking to sever the Conservatives from governing power, but this backfired tremendously, the National Party losing 2/3 of its seats to the more free market-friendly Conservatives, whose next ambition was to expand the vote to all free men, which at the moment remained out of their reach. In July, Scandinavia continued their renewed sense of colonial ambition by conquering each native tribe they encountered, pursuing a policy of forcing them off their land into the vast wilderness of the Great Plains. Later that month, a Frenchman slapped a Vannonian diplomat over a perceived diplomatic insult, leading to the Vannonian killing the Frenchman. The Vannonian, invoking diplomatic immunity, was stole away back to Vannonia, boosting the popularity of the National Party and President Scott. This was known as the Guernsey Affair and led to the channel between Vannonia and France shutting down for almost an entire year. In September, Poland-Lithuania declared war on Livomo, who were not signatories to the Treaty of Malta, with Scandinavia joining in, hoping to be rid of them. The war was short and led to minor territorial gains on the part of Poland-Lithuania. It is generally agreed that this did not end the count of the long peace. On the heels of this victory, Scandinavia struck gold in California and began a lightning-fast conquest of North America, the opportunity for which Vannonia passed up in exchange for maintaining extant colonies. Scandinavia would send an immense amount of people, both willingly and unwillingly, to the New World aboard great coal-burning ships in the course of a scant few years, laying stakes to most of the continent. The use of prisoners as colonists in exchange for their freedom was such a key tool in their sudden hegemony over the continent that Scandinavian prisons ran out of people to fill them. Vannonia then responsively decided to pursue the complete conquest of the Mexican tribes beginning in August of 1842. This was the stage set for the Industrial Age. The Vannonian Conservative Party was the model for the 19th century, and Vannonia was quickly challenged as the colonial hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. And, yet still, the world remained in its peace.